I took a job as Santa at the mall because I had no other choice. The clinic bills kept arriving like a different kind of snow, white, relentless, piling up on the kitchen table. Claire hushed on the phone while I pretended to be the one who always had answers. Ethan's cough sounded worse in the night. You learn, very quickly, how loud desperation can be. It makes you take gigs you would otherwise laugh at. Sitting under a tree of LEDs, smiling through a fake beard, pretending to be the warm center of someone else's Christmas. What the employment ad didn't say was that the mall at night is not the same place you see on Saturdays. By day, people pass through its belly in predictable rhythms. Shopping carts, stroller wheels, the papered cheer of seasonal promotions. At night, it roars with the slow systems of maintenance, the hum of HVAC like a distant sea, fluorescent lights that never sleep, the soft mechanical breathing of animatronics somewhere in Kids Corridor C. It looks empty, but it is not. It is listening. I arrived the night before my first shift, suit folded into a garment bag, beard tucked like an afterthought. The grotto was smaller than I expected, a curtained nook behind glass, an oversized armchair bolted to the platform, a half-circle of chipped plaster candy canes. Fake snow clung to the baseboards like dust. To the left, a narrow door led to the staff break room, a space that smelled of coffee grounds and PVC. To the right, a line of photo backdrops, a painted sleigh, a star field, a fireplace with LEDs that kept blinking out of time. I set the suitcase down and told myself it was temporary. 1 month, maybe 2. Enough for the medicine, enough for the winter tires. He shuffled over like he'd been waiting in the painted snow forever. Cedar looked like a man who had been Santa so many years his face had become a map of the mall itself, fissures at the eyes, the pale leaf of his beard, hands that smelled faintly of oil and peppermint. He wore a maintenance vest over a sweater. His Santa coat hung from a hook behind him like an artifact. He didn't offer his name. He didn't need to. Everyone in the mall called him Cedar. He was the one who fixed the lights that wouldn't stay on, the one who knew where the spare bulbs were hidden, the one who had been paid in candy canes and grudging respect for longer than anyone could remember. He didn't ask about my credentials. He looked at me like he was cataloging the kind of man who accepts desperate work. "You look tired," he said. "You look like you carry something heavy for someone else." "Kids," I said. The word felt small. "My boy, that's why I'm here." Cedar only nodded, and then, after a long minute, he reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a paper, crumpled to the point of being soft, folded as if it had been read too many times. "You want the job. You want to make it to payday. You're going to need this." He didn't hand it over at first. He unfolded it, smoothing it on his knee like a map someone had kept in a boot. The page was a scrap from a ledger, browned at the edges. Across the top, in a cramped, looping hand, were 7 lines. They were not rules as you'd expect them in a safety bulletin. They were more like things to remember when the rest of the world had gone dark. He read them to me like he was telling a prayer. "Rule 1, he said, and the rasp in his voice made the fluorescent hum quieter. "Keep the grotto closed after dusk." "That's—" I began. It sounded ridiculous. "Close the curtain? That's security theater, right? The curtain's there so kids can be surprised." "You think that now," Cedar said. "You think that until a night when the line's long and the curtain shivers by itself." He had been Santa before, he told me. He had seen empty chairs filled by shadows, felt breath where there was no mouth. He had been the one to lock the door and count the time. He had seen what found men who wore masks and smiled for a living. He handed me the paper. The list was scribbled in ink that had run a little at the edges. I had never been a superstitious man, but I folded the scrap into my wallet anyway. It felt absurd and heavy in my pocket. Cedar read the rest out loud, as if the words themselves would protect us from forgetting. Rule 2, carry honest light, battery, not twinkle. Rule 3, never let a child see you afraid. Rule 4, ignore the voices that say your name through the vents. Rule 5, keep a ledger, write the things you are ashamed of and read them aloud each night. Rule 6, the suit is a mantle, do not let strangers dress you. Rule 7, if they gather, do not hide, bring the light and speak your true name. 7 rules. I remember thinking in that first night, braced against the lip of the grotto, that the list was a theatrical aside, an old man's way to make the job sound more noble, more dangerous than the annual photographs and sticky patrons. It gave the place a kind of gravity I wasn't prepared for. I had rehearsed my ho-ho-ho in the car, imagined the cooing of toddlers and the forced laughs of parents, the gentle hands of strangers resting on my knee. I had not imagined being handed a survival checklist. That first evening the rules felt ornamental. I put on my suit, the fake fur scraped against my wrist, and I adjusted the beard so it didn't itch at the bridge of my nose. I practiced what I'd say to families, a line for the toddlers, a joke for the tweens, a quick posture that said sincerity without being magnetic. I kept the scrap folded inside my wallet like something the length of a fingernail. The mall lit up as the weekend crowd thinned. By 9, the last of the shoppers had passed through, footsteps folding away, doors clicking shut with a muted finality. In the grotto, under light that hummed in soft mercury tones, the line sputtered with the last 3 patrons, a woman with a toddler who clung to her leg, a teenage couple who rolled their eyes at the experience, and a pair of elderly sisters who liked to sit on Santa's knee for reasons that had everything to do with the weight of time. Nobody came after them. The attendant at guest services winked and left a small tray of candy at the desk. The animatronic reindeer in the display over the platform let out a mechanical whine when I leaned in. Its glass eyes caught the grotto light and scattered it into tiny alien stars. I remembered Rule 1 then, keep the grotto closed after dusk. It meant more than pulling the curtain. Cedar had meant boundaries, lines of work that shouldn't be crossed, a thin membrane between the person you play and the person you are. I drew the curtain tight that night and locked the little side door out of habit more than faith. The lock turned with a small clunk, the pretend wood under my palm warm from use. I made the chair my station. I sat and I watched the square of mall through the glass. Empty benches, a janitor pushing a trash cart like an island, a snowman inflatable drooping in the window of a closed novelty store. It took minutes, then an hour, for the air to change. It was a slow thing, a settling that begins like someone clearing their throat in the next room. The overhead LEDs began their irregular stutter, one of them seizing, the light pulsing in a way that made the painted fire seem to shift. A lullaby from the mall's pipe system faltered and croaked. It was the kind of electrical breath that never gets fixed all at once, the kind where you begin to notice the small failures around you. A speaker that plays Carol of the Bells on a loop and then erases the last bar into static. A display's animatronic that blinks out of rhythm. Carry honest light, Cedar had said. Battery, not twinkle. I had a flashlight in my break room locker, the kind you buy in a hardware aisle because you think you might need it one day. Before the first week was out, I upgraded it to a heavy-duty work lamp I kept tucked behind the chair, its battery square and reliable. That first night, I used the little flashlight in my pocket, hollow and warm. The light it gave off was honest enough to keep the hollow in the grotto from looking too dark, but it would not have been enough for what came later. At around midnight, an odd thing happened. I heard the sound before I saw it, a scraping, a thin, patient noise like the tips of nails across the inside of a vent. It traveled through the vents above the kids' play area and made the painted stars of the sleigh backdrop shiver. My throat tightened. Rule 4, ignore the voices, thudded against my ribs. I shouldn't answer. I didn't. The scraping moved, as if searching, like someone trying to find the seam in the world. It came closer. The speakers in the hallway, meant to pipe carols into the mall, picked up a whisper I would later swear could have been my name. My name sounded precisely like itself if someone who had studied my life all evening chose to pronounce it in a delightfully familiar device. "Jake?" it said, voice thin as paper. The sound came through the vent with a childish, high-pitched quality that made my skin prickle. It wasn't a voice that held fact, only suggestion. It had the soft edges of a voice from a memory. I stood. The toy reindeer in the display twitched, its head jerking like a startled animal. The 2 elderly sisters had already left. The teenage couple's exit had been earlier. It was only me, the chair, the platform, and the curtain, and then there was something behind the curtain that made the curtain move in a way buttons and zippers do not make them move. A draft, I thought, the HVAC. My heart hammered with the torque of humiliation. I breathed, slow, consiling myself with science. Afterwards, when I told Claire about that night, how irrationally my hands had been shaking, she said, "You're tired, Jake." That was practical love. It seamed up the worry with a word. But tired or not, there was a pressure in that mall that night, not quite physical and not quite imagined. The lights stuttered on and off in a pattern that almost matched the rasp of Cedar's voice. I told myself it was the city's power grid, the old building's whine. I told myself these are the stories maintenance men tell to make the hours interesting. I broke Rule 3 that night. Never let a child see you afraid. It wasn't that a child watched me, it was that I watched a child. The toddler on a cluttered lap looked at me with an absorbent, absolute trust, and something in me shifted. He had the clear eyes of a child who did not yet know the world could be cruel in the ways adults learn. He came close, and his small hand curled around my thumb without demanding artifice. He asked for nothing but a joke. I should have given him a gentle, practiced laugh. Instead, when the whisper came, I flinched. The toddler glanced up, confusing the tremor of the suit with the tremor of the man beneath it. His mouth pursed, worry softening the jaw. I mumbled some nonsense about toy trains and caught my breath. The woman with him paid my nervousness no mind, because parents are built with filters for the messy edges of public performance. That small breach, me flinching, felt like a small ammunition deposit for whatever watched in the roof. It felt like an accounting of fear, a receipt. Later, Cedar would say, "They don't eat your heart, they eat everything you want to hide about it." Panic tastes like a ringing coin in the dark. He spoke like a man who had let the ledger stay open too long. On my second week, the mall posted a sign about a holiday spectacular event, extended hours, free parking for the evening, a chance to increase tips. The idea of a bumper night of patrons was generous to my bank balance, if not to my nerves. That night I kept the curtain closed and the door locked, and I kept my flashlight on the hem of the chair. But somewhere between the Santa shifts, someone had decided to run extra lights over the main promenade. The mall's glow bled through the glass, and the grotto's painted fireplace looked cheerier for it. Sometimes daylight, or the mall's imitation of it, is unkind. The more light you have, the more shadows you give permission to move. Flecks of shadow hail in the corners like moths. The speakers around the display hummed with pre-recorded laughter. You expect recorded laughter to sound empty. What I didn't expect were recorded voices to slither into phrases that were not on the catalog. Names, fragments of private things that felt like diaries read by a stranger.
I would learn later that the watchers use the vents and the speakers like a mouth. They borrow the mall's systems to shape phantoms out of rumor. I would learn to distrust the false security of decorative strings. But that night, I was still the kind of man who would be talked into staying late for extra pay. A new sheet of paper slid under the curtain while I tended to a line. It was a small, folded note, the kind a child might drop without knowing. I unfolded it with the same casual patience I used to unfold clinic invoices. On one side, a child's drawing, stick figure family around a blocky house, eyes absent from each face. On the other, a message, written in a looping, uneven scrawl. Please don't be lonely. They like lonely. I looked up. The corridor was empty. The decorative icicle lights in the storefront across the lane shimmered something like static. I tucked the note into my pocket and read it again in the break room after I finished my shift. The note was a breadcrumb that mattered. It wasn't menacing exactly. It was small, plaintive, as if someone had dropped out of habit into a pattern. I remembered Rule 5, keep a ledger, and in my wallet I allowed myself the first honest record. The note, its words like a key. The ledger I kept did not start as ritual. It began as a way to prove to myself that I was not losing my mind. I wrote down the strange things I saw, the time the lights would skip, the pattern to the whisper. I wrote down the sentence the toddler drew. I wrote on a page of the ledger a small list of failures. The time I had missed Ethan's school play because I was at an extra shift. The nights I had pretended I had been at the shop when I'd been at a gig. The thing I did one summer that I still folded away like a note in the back pocket of my dignity. I do not like to put shame on a page. It makes the shame look like information, and information can be used. Cedar insisted I read those lines aloud each night before I sat down in the chair, even if there was no one there to hear me. On the third week, I fluked into testing Rule 4 without meaning to.
There was a sound in the vent right above the grotto, precise now, air through a seam and then a word that was not my name but a fragment that sounded like the shape of it. The voice used my boy's nickname. Ethan, if said through vents, sounds tender and small, like it can be folded into a pocket. It could have been a mother calling. It could have been a recorded announcement somebody had keyed wrong. But earlier that afternoon I had taken Ethan's drawing from the refrigerator at home and tucked it into my pocket. A crude portrait of a man with a circle of stars around his head. When the vent said the nickname, it perched on the edge of my chest like a calling card. The rule was simple. Ignore the voices that say your name through the vents. When a voice borrows a name, it is asking you to answer in return. It is asking you to show an intimacy that will be used as a rope. I did not answer. I told myself that was a moment of courage. In truth, I was navigating a thin line between bravery and frozen terror. The little light I kept on my chest flicked as if someone had pressed the switch with an invisible thumb. The tug of wanting to verify that it was real, Ethan's name, real or fake, nearly made me move. I almost stood up from the chair and went searching into the vents like a man who goes after the sound of his own name. Then I thought of the toddler's wide eyes from that first night and the way I'd flinched, and I kept sitting. I kept the theater of it. I breathed, and I read one of my ledger's small shame lines aloud, the ledger pages warm between my palms. It worked for that night. The voice in the vent dissolved into pipe noise or static or the mall's indifferent machinery. The suit kept its contours. The toddler kept his silence. I told myself I had obeyed Rule 4 and Rule 5 simultaneously, and that knowledge was a thin talisman. Yet the success felt incomplete, like triumph that didn't quite reach the bones. There is a peculiar intimacy to saying aloud the things you regret. It moves them from the hidden place where creatures feed on them into the room with you where there is light and witnesses. The act felt ceremonial. In the weeks after, I learned to pair the reading with a physical light, not the mall's ornaments, but a lamp with honest battery glow, one that threw proper shadows and didn't glitter like a lie. In the line between voice and beam, the watchers had less room.
Maybe they rely on the seams between what people will admit to themselves and what they will not. Tom's call came 2 nights later. Tom was a name like a bruise from the past, someone I'd grown up with, someone whose bad decisions had offered me company. He'd worked seasonal jobs when we were younger, and sometimes he'd been the kind of friend who made choices easier by being reckless with his own life.
Now, his voice on the phone sounded hollowed by something I hadn't yet seen. He had worked mall security years ago at another place. He knew the feeling of empty corridors. He told me offhand to watch my back. "Weird energy there," he said, a casual way of delivering concern. "Stay near the exits, Jay. Don't be foolish." I wanted to say more about Ethan, about the clinic bills, about why I'd taken the job, but I kept everything economic on that call. Tom asked if he could drop by after his shift. I said yes, not because I wanted company, though the idea of an old friend was comforting, but because there is safety in circles of familiarity. He was a man who smelled like cigarettes and engine oil. He wore a jacket 2 sizes too large. He brought a flask and a grin that used to mean an apology was on the way. We talked about small things, the suited routines, how to hold attention with a child who hates sitting on laps, the way some parents treat the grotto with an intimacy that blurred boundaries. She wanted to trade a photograph with me, to have a private joke about the suit. She reached, fingers quick, and touched the sleeve in a friendly manner. "You should have seen the Santa who used to sit here," she said. "He'd always switch his belt for the real thing, said it made his laugh deeper." Something in the gesture made me flinch in a way that wasn't fear for myself, but anxiety about what it meant to be an actor who could be mistaken for the man inside him. For the next shift, I enforced Rule 2 like a religious man. I carried the work lamp so close to my body, the battery warmed the fibers of my coat. I kept a spare in the locker. A staff member joked at me when I brought in the second lamp, called me thorough, but jokes are cheap and lights are not. The lamp cut through the mall's false cheer and made the painted fireplace look honest in a way the LEDs never could. The reindeer stopped twitching. The calls in the vent came more distant that night, as if the light dissuaded them from approaching the platform. On the 7th night, I tested Rule 6 by accident. After a particularly long line, a woman slipped into the break room with a nutcracker on a leash, a novelty she'd won at a nearby vendor. She was one of those people who treated the grotto with an intimacy that blurred boundaries. She wanted to trade a photograph with me, to have a private joke about the suit. She reached, fingers quick, and touched the sleeve in a friendly manner. "You should have seen the Santa who used to sit here," she said. "He'd always switch his belt for the real thing, said it made his laugh deeper." Something in the gesture made me flinch in a way that wasn't fear for myself, but anxiety about what it meant to be an actor who could be mistaken for the man inside him.
I stepped back in a rare moment of clarity. The suit is a mantle. Do not let strangers dress you. I told her, politely, no thanks. Keep the costume on. Keep the roles separated. She laughed and wandered away, unaware. That night's ledger note was short. A woman touched my sleeve. I backed away. I wrote my shame line about a time I quietly accepted less than I deserved for a job because I thought it was easier, and I read it aloud, lamp on my knees. The words tasted like salt. Days folded into one another with the sameness of ornaments on racks. The mall's nights taught me tiny disciplines. I kept my curtains closed, my lamps charged, my ledger open. I ignored names on vents. I practiced not showing fear where children might see. I swore off trading my suit with strangers. It was a narrative of ritual, a small armor of repetition. The rules gave me a map, and the map made me a cautious man. Then, mid-December, something broke the map. It started with an employee miscount at the photo desk. Someone noticed that a child's drawing had been moved from the display case to the floor. It was a silly thing, small and petty,
but the drawing was one of those I had been keeping as a kind of talisman, a small rectangle of paper Ethan had scribbled at home in a fever of imagination. The drawing had eyes with tiny circles colored out. When the desk attendant mentioned it, I felt the old ache of ownership and the new ache of violation. The drawing was always with me, tucked into the pages of my ledger, but now it was gone. Cedar said, later, the watchers like to borrow, they leave marks. He said it loosely, as if the theft were an inevitable thing of the building. He told me, though, that theft leads to daring. If you let the small things go, they will take the bigger ones next. I found the drawing not far from the grotto, jammed behind the baseboard where the decorative pine met the floor. It had been placed there as if someone had intended me to find it. The eyes were still colored out. A new note lay beside it, thinner than those before, written on hotel stationery somebody had saved. They like names. They like small pauses. I brought the drawing to the break room and pressed my thumb against the graphite where my son's small face sat. The breath left me like a lost balloon. I was careful then, more cautious than I'd been, and yet the story had already shifted. Where there had been rules to follow, there was now a sense of being chosen by the place, like a stage that had decided which actor it wanted to keep. You learn, in a job like that, the thin line between theater and theater of menace. The mall is a complex apparatus of human things made into habit. It feeds on patterns. The watchers, if they were even creatures or not the accumulation of system failures and old soldiers' tales, seemed to love the pattern I provided. I was bait with a soft center. I wanted to buy medicine. The mall wanted nothing but a rhythm.
That night, after the drawing, after the whispered notes, Tom showed up at the grotto not as the friend I remembered, but as a man who had distanced himself from everything important. He had the look of somebody who had been out in a storm and decided that a shelter was an inconvenience. There was a loose bruise under his eye, and the way his smile slackened when he couldn't find the right joke. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice as if the lights themselves might hear. "I can help you with this. There are ways of dealing. You don't have to do it their way." What he suggested felt like a shortcut. He proposed adjustments, things that would blur the line between Santa and someone else, a way to sleep in the back room, to leave the curtain open, to share duties with someone else who owed you favors. He wanted me to bend the rules into convenience. Tom had always been the kind of man who wanted answers that made surviving easier. I hesitated, and for a moment the ledger pages in my pocket felt like they might be a judge. Cedar had told me to not trade the mantle. To let Tom's plan happen would be to hand the suit to another hungry man. I told him no that night, and the refusal tightened some small thing inside of him. For the first time since I'd known him, Tom looked like a man who might take something from the place itself if he thought it would make his life less messy. You can imagine the hours after that like the slow turning of a key. The mall's mechanisms kept their own time. Lights began skipping in new patterns, the speakers cued a carol in the wrong key, and the vent whispered the shape of a name that was not mine, but which sounded like an invitation. I slept poorly, on a cot in my car between shifts, listening to the lullaby of compressors and the sighing of back doors. I thought of Claire and Ethan at home, the small cities of their breathing, and I wrote into my ledger, "Do not let them be lonely for your choices." That line, this one, marks the seam where the safe story moves towards something else. It is the moment when rules stop being convenient instructions and begin to feel like the only thing that keeps your life from sliding under the floor. It's the moment you know the watchers are patient. On a night I had been scheduled to work until midnight and then come home, an alert came over the mall's system about a power blip.
In the break room, the maintenance supervisor, a practical woman named Rosa, muttered about the grid and left to fetch a pail of spare fuses. The grotto's curtain hung heavy and closed. The artificial fire's LEDs flickered. The lamp on my knee hummed steady. It was then that I learned the difference between small fear and the kind that comes with the certainty of being watched. I was halfway through reading from my ledger, a small confession about a time I had walked out on a job because I'd been afraid of responsibility, when the lights behind the promenade went out. Not a polite flicker, but a full-bodied plunge.
The fake snow in the windows looked like ash. The speakers absurdly continued to play, but the sound had been stripped, like vinyl played halfway through. The reindeer in the display jerked in stuttered motion. Then the important sound, across the mall, through the vents, like a string being pulled between floors, was the soft, slow rise of many quiet things moving at once. It was the noise of a crowd that is not a crowd, a movement through the sickly, warm air, a sliding of bodies under grills and behind storefront facades. The curtain shivered. I remembered the flash of heat from the lamp on my knee, like a star in a small room. The light made an honest shadow. It made the painted fireplace look like a cave. I felt in that instant something ancient, not like hunger, but like consideration. It came to the edge of the space and seemed to weigh whether I would obey the rules I'd been given. I do not remember choosing courage then. I remember remembering. I read a line from my ledger out loud, the one where I had written about missing Ethan's recital. I read it like a prayer, and the letters felt like coals. I said his name, then Claire's name, then a few things that no one else had been allowed to hear. The light on my knee grew stubbornly bright, and the sound slipped like water from a bowl. Something answered from the vents then, not with a voice, but with a pressure, like a draught into which a thought had been poured. It said nothing I could understand, and yet I felt a nausea of recognition. It wanted me to be small. Then the curtain moved. More than a draught. Something was pressing upon it from the other side. Fingers at the hem, a slow testing of fabric. The grotto platform seemed to tilt. I kept reading. Rule 5 told me to keep a ledger and read my shame aloud. I repeated the lines, and the light in my hand didn't falter. The sound behind the curtain increased into a whispering that pressed at the seams of the grotto's little world. The fabric bulged, as if someone large stood close on the other side and breathed. There was the sense of being measured. I will leave this moment with the memory of the lamp's honest illumination and the slow tightening of the curtain. I will leave it at the place where the story bent, and the watchers, if that is what they were, decided to make their first real attempt to cross the line. I did not know then how the 7 rules would be tested, traded, broken, or honored in the nights to come. I didn't know that a friend would return, not as himself, but as something carved from the mall's appetite. I didn't know that confession would be a weapon, or that light would be a fragile, temporary boon. I only knew in that minute, with the fabric bulging against the platform, that some things wanted me to be smaller than I was.
I thought of Claire and Ethan, of the way Ethan had clapped on the living room floor when I made a bad radio voice for a cartoon, of the times Claire had smiled like she was holding the map of my better tendencies. I tightened my hand on the lamp, the battery feeling like a pulse, and I said aloud, one more time, the most shameful line in my ledger. They recoiled, or maybe they paused. The difference matters little now. What matters is that light and the act of naming combined into a small, temporary victory. The curtain drew back, slowly, the seam revealing not a face but a shape that wanted to be familiar. Whatever it was, it paused, assessing. When the opening came, I stood, and then everything else pushed into motion. The fabric heaved like lungs, something fleshy, if you can call it flesh when it's made of drafts and memory, pressed fingers at the seam. The curtain dimmed under the pressure, and the sound that came through the microfiber wasn't air, it was an intention. I remember thinking, with a clarity that steadied me more than it frightened me, that fear has a sound the way an engine has a note. It's a low, patient chord. Whatever was on the other side was tuning itself. I kept reading from the ledger. I said the line about missing Ethan's recital like a confession and also like a weapon. The words tasted of rust and of relief. I had written them months ago, an ugly, honest thing, and now the ledger had weight. The lamp on my knee threw a cone. The cone did not glitter, it cut. The margin of light made the painted candy canes look solid, real in a way they hadn't been. The bulge in the curtain stopped for a long breath. Something moved in the gap, not through the fabric, but as an idea of a thing. It took the shape of my father's jaw in one quick glimpse, then the angle of a neighbor's shoulder, as if it was stealing frames from my life like stolen clothes. It wanted familiarity, wanted to fold itself into the comfortable lie of my days. It wanted me to respond with a small private admission. I am less than I seem. Be small for us. Give us whatever will make you lighter. Jake, came a sibilant sound, but it wasn't my name so much as the idea of my name. Not the syllables exactly, some shape of them, the echo of nights when I had called myself softer names to get through the bills. It was a hunger turned polite. I closed the ledger and struck the lamp hard against the platform. The light flared, and the bulb gave the space a focus like a finger. Whatever waited receded like smoke away from flame. The curtain trembled, and then the mall resumed its low, indifferent, mechanical song, as if nothing had happened at all. The reindeer blinked like an animal waking. I learned that night, at the edge of the grotto, that Rule 5 was not a superstition. Keep a ledger, write the things you are ashamed of, and read them aloud each night was not a quaint ritual of guilt.
It was a weapon that took the oxygen from lies. The act of naming the wound made it less tasty. The watchers, if they were more than the building's old circuits and the small cruelties of a place that collects lonely people, were opportunists. They chewed on what you pretended wasn't there. I slept in the car, hands sticky with fake frosting from the sample tray we'd used for a display, and thought about what it would mean to keep doing the job. Claire's face slotted into the small moments of memory like a human sun. Ethan's cough was a storm I couldn't negotiate. I had taken the job to buy time, not to make a new story for myself. Cedar's list had sounded like a ritual then. It sounded like the only map now. If you want the full breakdown of every rule and how I survived, subscribe and stick around. This isn't the sort of thing you should hear piecemeal. The nights that followed were a ledger of near misses. Rule 1. Keep the grotto closed after dusk. I learned its perimeter mattered. The curtain was not just privacy, it was a membrane. The first time I left it open after dark, stupid, careless, a moment of vanity when a line of parents lingered and wanted photos with the Santa reveal, I watched the air slip through the gap and carry with it a whisper that looked like a child's idea of a smile. A child reached for me and thought my movement a part of the performance. The parent laughed. I smiled in a way that was practice, not truth. When the line left and I zipped the curtain, the gap didn't close so much as fold away.
Later, at home, a small drawing of Ethan's would be found under the vinyl skirting, the eyes colored by someone else. It was a note from the building. Boarders, once left unattended, invite guests. Rule 2. Carry honest light. I became obsessive. My locker looked like a floodlight shop. The heavy-duty lamp with the true battery that warmed against my ribs became part of the suit, the way the belt and boots were. I learned to angle it not to blind children, but to make the space biodegradable to shadows. Once, when a small morse of shuffling came from the vents near the arcade, I pulled the lamp across the floor and held it against the underside of a display. The light showed the dust, the wiring, the greasy fingerprints of service people. The watchers slithered away from that brightness like things that resent being seen. Fake lights, strings, LEDs, the mall's decorative twinkles, had no authority. They were jewelry on a thief. They reflected fear back on itself. The honest light didn't sparkle. It made things visible. That was why it worked. Rule 3. Never let a child see you afraid. That rule was less about dignity and more about supply. One night, a teenager's prank nearly ruined me. He shoved a fake spider into the pocket of my coat and shouted with the gang. The reflex was animal, a quick inhale, a hand to throat. A toddler's gaze fell on me at that exact second, and the child registered the tremor as instruction. If your Santa is afraid, maybe fear is the thing in the world tonight. I forced a laugh, told the kid a clownish joke, and gave the toddler a small candy that had my fingerprints on it. The child left believing the world was safe. I left believing I had purchased another evening's peace with a lie. Every instance where a child's trust was allowed to see my fracture was an investment the watchers could cash. Rule 4. Ignore the voices that say your name through the vents. On paper, it sounded absurd. In practice, it was almost gossamer in its power. Names are lines to the heart. I had always corrected to my own name, corrected to the role, Santa, when the vents wanted the private name. The first time the vents borrowed Ethan's nickname, I did not answer, and the voice changed. It climbed instead to something broader, like a catalogue of small failures. But the second time, after a long shift and a cup of coffee with a lid that leaked my patience, I hadn't yet read my ledger. The vents said, softly, Dad. It wasn't a taunt, it was sugar. The floor under me felt unsteady, like a stage with a missing board. My lamp felt like a child's toy in my hand. I might have stood up, might have followed that sound into vents and storerooms where pipes hummed and insulation folded, had I not heard the sound of Tom's footsteps on the tiles outside the grotto. Tom's arrival that night changed everything. He came in not with the gait of a friend, but with a swagger that had been rewired to something else. His eyes didn't find the lines of the mall, they fixed on the suit. He had been at my side once, making bad choices with me. Now he sauntered like an instrument of the place. He said, "You carrying more than usual?" And his voice had a soft undertone that I later recognized as a hunger for the mantle itself. We argued, softly at first, in the back room where the coffee machine coughed. He tried to talk me into sharing the shifts, into swapping the suit for real sleep, into letting him take a midnight opening on the promise we'd split the weekend money. It sounded sensible and pathetic. It also sounded like a door. He claimed with that old negligent charm that he knew ways of being less lonely. "They don't have to take everything, Jay," he said. "We can make friends with the building. You don't have to be the defensive kind." I told him no. The ledger's pages, warm in my pocket, sat like a jury. He left angry. He came back different. Later, when the corridors of the mall thrummed with more recorded laughter than customers, I found a photograph in my locker.
One of those glossy promos gifted to employees, a picture of the old group of us, Tom grinning. He had cut his eyes away from the camera in a way that made the face look wrong. A note on the back had been written with careful pressure. They like the cheerful ones. They like the ones who forget.
The corrupted Tom was the kind of person the watchers could spend. He came to the grotto once, sometime after midnight when business had thinned and the janitorial rounds had become more halting. He didn't knock, he just unzipped the curtain and stepped over the threshold like a thief who paid his taxes. He wore my Santa belt around his waist for a time, and it fit like it belonged to him. He laughed carelessly. The laughter made the ceiling sweat. He tried to trade places with me. He wanted the mantle. I refused, and his face fell into a blank that was almost comic and almost terrible. He reached for the beard, and I remembered Rule 6. The suit is a mantle. Do not let strangers dress you. It is, at heart, the rule that keeps identity from being communal. I remembered it, and I pushed him away. He spat on the floor with a sound like a dropped coin. After that, he did not come back as a friend. He came back as a warning. When Tom returned that time, the vents hummed a harmony with his voice. He said my name the way the vents did, soft, weighted, and the sound slid into the cartilage of the building. He'd been missing shifts. He'd been sleeping in the back of a closed store. He'd been doing favors. When I refused him, his jaw tightened. I have the image burned. Tom placing his hand on the arm of the chair where I sat, feeling the place, not like a friend, but like a man appraising an object. Later, the same hand would be found on Cedar's shoulder, and Cedar would not remember a time the hand had been friendly. If Rule 6 had been a lesson about boundaries, the price of violating it was swift. Tom began to wear pieces of the mall's oddness like a cloak. He would stand in storefronts with the mannequins and watch the shoppers like a desire for purchase. The watchers are patient. They find people they can borrow from, and then they straighten those people into tools. There is no violence in it at first, only the slow evaporation of the things that make someone human. The breach came on a night when the mall ran a Midnight Family Magic promotion, the kind of marketing that thinks nostalgia is currency. The corridors filled with people wearing pajamas, with small children clutching plush toys, with tired parents who thought this would be a one-off miracle. The grotto hummed. The lamp on my knee grew warm with the number of faces I'd made small lies for. It was Christmas Eve. The air tasted like the burnt sugar of concession stand pretzels. By 9:30, the mall's electricity hiccuped. My light stayed steady because I'd stashed extra batteries. A dozen other conveniences blinked out. The crowd condensed like wet fabric and then recomposed, edges brushing. The speakers began to channel something in the space between songs, a murmur threaded under the carols like a second, older chorus. People who had come for pictures laughed nervously when the music stumbled. The watchers took notice of laughter. They measure it. At the height of the night, some child screamed. Not a piercing, fearful thing, but an alarm, sharp and sudden, because the grotto's curtain tore. I remember the sound like a rip in cheap upholstery. We were not prepared. The seams split as if an invisible force had chosen a place to enter the world. The curtain opened on its own volition, and something poured through. No, that's not right. Something pushed against the seam and squeezed, like a hand pushing a tendril. The initial intrusion wasn't huge. It was a suggestion in the shape of a person's shadow. Behind it, other shapes waited, pressed up against the edges of store windows, the backs of display cases, the vents above the arcade. The mall's holiday displays, the animatronics, the mannequins, anything that wears a hollow face seemed to open. Cedar was there because he always was when the building wanted someone to remember its boundaries. He'd been on his rounds when the seam tore and came over cursing. He had the look of a man who had been repaired too often. He didn't say much.
He walked up to the curtain as though it were a child misbehaving and tried to pull it back into place. "Remember the last line," he said under his breath. He put his palm against the fabric, and I saw it tremble, like something feeling for mood. The hand came away with a smear of something, not quite dust and not quite sludge. Cedar's eyes were bloody moons. "They like bargains," he said, with a voice that had swallowed a dozen long nights. He tried to shove the curtain closed, and the seam closed for a moment and then opened like a fish mouth. He made a decision then I will never forget. He reached past the split with his free hand and slapped the platform. He turned and looked at me, and for the first time he spoke the seventh rule. "If they gather," he said, "do not hide. Bring the light and speak your true name." The words had the authority of a man who had learned the end of the list the hard way. He looked like someone who had been told in his body that the final page had been written in the margins of too many others. Then he saw Tom. Tom stood just beyond the curtain, with the suit belt hanging from his shoulder like a question mark. His mouth was open slightly, and the lights in his pupils were thin. Cedar's jaw closed as though he'd swallowed a hard thing. He moved fast, like a maintenance man, and I remember hoping he would come to me and tell me to run. It wasn't his fault he didn't. He went for Tom instead, hands out as if to pull him back to humanity. Tom did a small, ridiculous thing and struck Cedar's hand, a flinch of defense. Cedar grabbed at Tom's collar, and in that instant the seam widened and something slipped through. The thing that slipped out was not a person and not an animal. It moved with the indecent certainty of something that has practiced speech by watching us. It smelled faintly of old pipe and peppermint. It took the shape of a child's laughter folded into shadow and then spread to occupy the space like spilled ink. It touched Cedar's face, and for a second he smiled, a brittle thing, and then his eyes rolled to the whites. He sagged back. Tom's hand was on his shoulder, and the touch looked like a transaction. I grabbed the work lamp, the honest light, and I swung it. The beam cut through the shadow like a blade. The creature hissed as if burned and drew back. The curtain slammed closed as if someone had pulled on it mightily. The grotto became a sealed cave. Parents screamed on the promenade. Security lights flared in a staccato. When we pried the curtain back minutes later, Cedar was there on the platform, but not all the way in his skin. He had lost something. His face was a map of the last 10 winters. He lifted his head and whispered the words of Rule 7, the final 9. He said them like a prayer and like a sentence being read for the last time. He did not survive the night in the way we expect survivors to. He was taken, not in a dramatic rip-off, but in a way that felt clinical, a slump that didn't quite fill. Security arrived with radios, and the police followed, and the mall executives talked in cold circles about coverage and insurance. The official report would later say something about a fainting spell and a minor electrical issue. That was the kind of neatness institutions like. The ledger, the note, the smear on the curtain, none of it fitted in their forms. Cedar, before he left the world he had stubbornly kept within his body's borders, pressed a crumpled scrap into my hand. His fingers made mine tighter than they needed to. He breathed once, and he said the rest of the list, in case my memory wanted to fail me, and then he smiled at me like a man returning a borrowed coin. "Keep the ledger," he said. "Light. Names. Don't let them dress you. And," he coughed, a small, feral thing, "if they gather, don't lie down." I had to watch him carried away with a professionalism that made it sound like a store policy. The regular chatter at mall staff radios swallowed the rawness of his absence. Tom was gone by morning. Later they'd find him in a closed storefront, curled in a hull of mannequins. He looked at us with the eyes of something that had been softened by heat. I had to tell a version of what happened to security that fit within their forms. I wrote it down in my ledger afterward. In the margin, I wrote, "I refused him." That sentence felt like the cost of a small thing. The nights after Cedar's absence were the worst. The watchers realized they had a vacancy at the edge of the world's stage. The mall's systems, vents, speakers, the little glittering ornaments found new patterns to exploit. I learned over and over how a human will slide into a role when offered a costume. I lived with the knowledge that I was nearing whatever measure the building used to decide who it wanted to borrow next.
The final test came on a night the mall was closed to the public after a rumor had spread through employee channels that a potential investor would tour the property at dawn. We were all told to stay late for a final walkthrough. I had been working overtime to keep money in the account and medication in the cabinet. The grotto had been patched after the seam rip, the curtain re-sewn, the baseboard caulked. We had extra staff, security walking a particular pattern, a manager making loud notes on a clipboard. The building smelled like cleaning solvent and pressure. It was the kind of quiet that makes false things sound honest. Around 2 a.m, the advertising monitors along the promenade froze and then began to play a sequence of images that appeared to be the mall's own holiday montage, but sliced and overlaid with other things. The smile of a child from a stolen photograph, a hand pressing a button, a corridor at dusk. The picture was a choreography of recall. Somewhere above, the vents hummed a slow, gathering tone, and the animatronic figures near the fountain began to move in a pattern that almost matched the rhythm of breathing. The watchers were a patient conspiracy of absence. They moved like fog at first from the vents into the hollow spaces between storefronts, pooling in the corners of decorative nativity scenes, slipping behind the fake trees. When a group of them crossed the atrium, it looked like a crowd in silhouette, a negative space audience pressing at the glass. People around me started to whisper and point, and I could hear panic like a foreign currency. It made the watchers richer. Cedar had told me the final rule not as a thing to be easy, but as a last resort. If they gather, do not hide. Bring the light and speak your true name.
It took on a new meaning in the face of the crowd's hunger. The watchers wanted us small. They wanted us to curl. They wanted us to hand them the account of our shame and then to curl in the account like a coin. The room around me focused into a narrow and precise idea. If I did nothing, the mall would give up something more than my shift. I took off the beard because I needed the tie of honesty. I would not give them the weight of an anonymous face. I climbed the platform with the lamp in my hand, and I opened my ledger. The crowd in the atrium backed away as if they could feel the force of being seen. Tom, in his hollow angle of a storefront, watched. For a moment he looked like himself, and then he looked like a man who had an old hunger in his chest and didn't know how to feed it. Cedar, absent and indelible, was a memory that made my chest ache. I read the ledger out loud. I read the small, terrible things I had written, the times I had chosen ease over presence, the nights I had not been home when my son needed me at a school performance, the lie to a neighbor about working late to mask the fear of failing, the secret hum of anger I had kept like a coin in my pocket. I spoke names: Ethan, Claire, my father. I said them as if they were ropes, as if I were handing them to the light. The act was not dramatic. It was naked and humiliating and slow. People in the promenade stopped breathing. Lights wavered. The watchers leaned in, because there's a curiosity to those who confess. There is always an appetite for the private divulged. But the ledger had weight. Saying the name of my son aloud made the place have to acknowledge him. The watchers taste intimacy. When presented with it in the light, they recoiled because the confession stole the lie that kept them fit. Speaking true names is less a spell than an obligation. You are naming the world you are part of, and the dark, which is parasite, dislikes being parented. I felt them collect in the corners and then strike toward the platform like ink drawn to a blot. They rubbed against the base of the chair, mimicked the curve of an arm. In the crowd, someone began to cry. In the shadows, Tom appeared, a creature wrapped in a suit that did not fit his bones. He came to the edge of the stage and reached for the mantle with a hunger that looked like devotion. I said his name, Tom, loud and without hatred. Saying his name made the thing that wore him hesitate. Naming does not always save. It is a weapon and a plea. I swung the heavy lamp like a breaker, and the light cleaved the air. The shadows flinched. A security guard hit the emergency switch, and storefront lights surged with a harsh, industrial honesty that peeled shadow from mannequin. The watches hissed and folded like wet paper. They do not like honest light. They do not like names. But the final stroke was not brute force. It was confession fused with claim.
I held the lamp, and I said things out loud that no one in the mall had the right to know. The ugly things I had kept like contraband. I said them, and then I said what I loved. I paired shame with affection, guilt with names of people I intended to protect. My voice hoarse, I called Ethan by a name only a father uses, called Claire the way a man calls his partner when he promises to come back. The watchers right away hesitated when faced with the tenderness that belonged to other people. Shame alone feeds them. To pair shame with a light that names love is to starve them. The watchers thinned, not all at once, but like fog burning under a noon sun. Some of the figures that had been Tom sloughed away and returned him, small and trembling, on his knees, weeping. Not healed, but found in a way I would not have expected. Security moved in and did what they could. The manager's clipboard trembled in his hand like a betrayed conscience. Cedar's silence was a kind of victory, because the list he left behind had become a living thing. We were left with the aftermath that is always left after a thing is exercised in a place of commerce: cleanup crews, an awkward breakfast for staff, and a lock on the grotto that would be replaced with a better latch. The mall PR wrote a statement about an unexpected disturbance and staff heroism and precautionary measures. They asked for cooperation and did not ask for confession. The ledger stayed mine. I left the mall that dawn heavy in the way shoulders are after labor, and strangely lighter at the same time. There were cuts, emotional and otherwise, that would take longer to bind than the glue the display crew used. The suit's fur felt like an animal furrowed in me. The beard itched even after I had washed my face 3 times. I drove home in the shallow light that comes just before sunrise, and thought of the last line Cedar had given me. If they gather, do not hide. Bring the light and speak your true name. 2 things happened after that night. I stopped taking shifts after dark, and I started to sleep at home more. Cedar's name sat like an inheritance in my pocket. Tom called once, months later, from a halfway house with a voice that had been sanded. He told me flatly that he remembered parts of the night and didn't like what he had done. We did not reconcile so much as trade a few words across a gulf. He told me he had nightmares where he could feel the suit tighten on his chest, and called me by my name in the dream, begging for the ledger. I hung up, because there are boundaries that the rules intend to keep. The watchers did not vanish. They are patient enough to wait out a winter. Months later, when I passed the mall with Claire and Ethan driving home from a pediatrician's appointment, the decorative lights in the windows had the same crooked cheer. At the corner of the promenade near the fountain, I saw a pair of figures behind a storefront glass that might have been a reflection or might have been the gathering of dark. For a second, my hand tightened on the steering wheel, and the names on my tongue tasted like confession. I keep the ledger in a drawer now. I write in it when I am anxious and when I am honest. The list is not a charm, it is a habit.
when I have to be in public roles that eat identity, cashiers, substitute teachers, people asked to be performative sheathed for other people's comfort, I read a line, light a small, honest lamp in my head, and name the people I love. It is a ritual and a resistor. The 7 rules read again in my handwriting on a scrap of paper I keep folded with 2 creases. They are simple and precise. Rule 1. Keep the grotto closed after dusk. Rule 2. Carry honest light, battery, not twinkle. Rule 3. Never let a child see you afraid. Rule 4. Ignore the voices that say your name through the vents. Rule 5. Keep a ledger. Write the things you are ashamed of and read them aloud each night. Rule 6. The suit is a mantle. Do not let strangers dress you. Rule 7. If they gather, do not hide. Bring the light and speak your true name. They are not supernatural talismans. They are practices that create boundaries. They ask for courage and low, honest rituals. They are time-tested and not infallible. They saved me the night the curtain split. They also demanded things of me I had not expected. Humiliation, the relinquishing of performative bravado, the willingness to shout the names of the people I would protect under the worst of lights. People asked me weeks later why I stopped. I told them the story in careful increments, part heroism, part corporate spin. Claire asked me alone in the kitchen if the job was worth the scare. I thought about Ethan sleeping in the next room and about the smell of artificial pine on my coat. I told her the truth. I had taken the job because I needed to feed us. I left because the place wanted everything of me. She reached over and brushed a thumb across my nail, then held my hand like it was a piece of map. "You came back," she said. That is the best summary. I came back. We keep the ledger in a drawer. Sometimes I read it when I drive by the mall. Sometimes I take a lamp into the attic to change a bulb and hold it steady until the shadow tells me it's okay. I tuck Ethan's drawings into my pockets sometimes, not because I think they are a charm, but because they remind me of the reason I carry the lamp. When people ask if the story is real, I say 2 things that are both true. Yes, in the way that the dark is real, and yes, in the way that choices make consequences. The Watchers are not necessarily monsters of myth. They are the shape of the dark people bring into public roles where identity is borrowed. They are the hunger that devours unspoken things.
You starve them with honesty, with light, with the names of people who matter. There is a scar on my hand now, small and pale, from when a lamp slipped and I jerked it away during the breach. It looks like a thin moon, and Claire jokes that it's my Santa mark. I don't laugh. I stew the way memory sits in an old pan. I tell Ethan stories about Santa that do not require me to hide the fact I was once under a beard. I teach him to say his name like a claim. The mall keeps its own hours. Some nights, when the decorative LEDs blink and the building exhales steam from its vents like an old animal, I feel the small pressure of attention. The rules help me breathe. If this gave you chills, like and share this story. Tell me in the comments which rule you'd break or keep, and subscribe for more of these true-feeling horror stories. And if you ever find yourself in a place that asks for a costume you cannot return, remember to bring the light and say the names that make the world yours.